Hello everyone, looks like we'll get started. Buonasera a tutti e grazie per essere qui. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here this evening for our speaker series presentation. My name is Leah Nadine and I'm the president of the Institute of Italian Studies of Lakehead University. At this time, I'd like to introduce our board of directors of the Institute of Italian Studies, Mr. Richard Busset, Franco Crupi, Giovanni Bonofilio, Saverio Nigro, Joe Verderamo, Rosanne Rambaldini, Joe Quaresima, Angela Maltesi, John Potestio, Francesco Pedula, Joe Daniele, Anne Clemenco, Lina Nigro, Rosa Carlino, Mark Coivizana, and Silvio De Gregorio, some of which are here with us tonight and also some that couldn't make it. Thank you for coming, for those of you that are here. In preparing for this event, we've received in-kind support from La Società Italiana di Benevolenza, Principe di Piemonte, and additionally, a big thank you goes to Anne-Marie and Connie, as well as the staff at the Da Vinci Center, towards preparing for this event. On behalf of the Institute of Italian Studies, I am pleased to introduce local researcher and Lakehead University alumni, Mr. Justin O'Brien. Justin graduated from Lakehead University after receiving a master's degree in history. He now works as a long-term occasional teacher for the Thunder Bay Catholic District School Board, where he enjoys educating youth about history. He has a strong interest in researching the earliest 20th century, in particular the two world wars, from both a local and international perspective. This evening, in particular, Justin will be presenting his research about local Italian immigration to the Lakehead, which is titled Good Sons of Italy, Good Citizens of Canada, Early Italian Settlement at the Lakehead. Justin is honored to be here tonight and hopes that everyone, Italian and non-Italian alike, will find tonight's presentation both entertaining and informative. A reminder that we will have a 15-minute question and answer session following the presentation, followed by some light refreshments, and as well as opportunities to ask Justin some additional questions. Thank you all for your attention. Now, without further ado, here to speak about Italian settlement prior to World War I, please join me in welcoming our presenter, Mr. Justin O'Brien.
Thank you, Leah. And thanks to everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here tonight. Whether you're at the Da Vinci Center or watching our live stream on Facebook, I really appreciate you all being here. So before I get started, I just wanted to make 2 points. So I will be using a lot of Italian names and locations throughout my presentation, but since I don't speak Italian myself, please don't judge me too harshly if and when I mispronounce some words. Secondly, I will also be using a lot of acronyms in my PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to leave this slide up for a minute or two into my presentation, just so you can all familiarize yourselves with them. Okay. So without further ado, I will get started. Between 1880 and 1915, 13 million Italians left their homeland for various parts of the world, such as Brazil, Argentina, the United States, and Canada. The overwhelming majority were men, searching for employment to support themselves and any family that still resided in Italy. For many Italians, such a journey was considered temporary. These so-called birds of passage would work abroad until they had acquired enough money to return home and lead a comfortable life. Yet an increasing number of immigrants would settle in the countries to which they traveled, either bringing their existing family over or starting a new one in the New World. Italians that came to the twin cities of Fort William and Port Arthur were no exception. According to the 1880-81 census of Canada, only 5 people of Italian origin resided in Fort William. 30 years later, however, Italians would represent 5% of Thunder Bay's total population, with 917 and 472 living in Fort William and Port Arthur, respectively. While men made up the vast majority of the Italian people, some women and children were also present. Photographs, such as those of General Siciliano with his wife and son, as well as Maria Marcinet holding 2 children, lend credibility to the notion that Italian women and children were becoming an increasingly common sight at the Lakehead. An article in both the Fort William Morning Herald and the Port Arthur Daily News, dated December 3, 1907, best encapsulates the changing nature of Italian immigration. When a group of Italians leaving Fort William via the Canadian Pacific Railway, or CPR, were asked if they planned on staying home, one responded, "No, we are satisfied with this country and will come back here to live. We have plenty of money now to live on, and we are going to bring our wives and families over." Within the first decade of the 20th century then, the Lakehead was already home to a growing Italian community. What follows is an examination of these early settlers in the years prior to the First World War. To gain a greater sense of who the founding members of Thunder Bay's Italian community were, an examination of where they came from, as well as where they settled, will first be undertaken. The focus will then shift to the various struggles they were forced to endure, and finally to the ethnocultural organizations they established to support one another in their new, oftentimes harsh, environment. It will be shown that by 1914, Italian immigrants residing at the Lakehead retained various aspects of their culture, while at the same time adapting to life in North America, proving themselves to be good sons of Italy and good citizens of Canada. From what regions of Italy did these immigrants originate? While no demographic study concerning Thunder Bay's Italian population exists, it may be possible to reach tentative conclusions by examining a sample group of Italians that came to the Lakehead before 1925. The subjects of this group were gathered from interviews conducted by Antonio Pucci, obituaries, local history books, as well as memoirs written by second and third generation Italian immigrants detailing their experiences growing up in the Twin Cities. Of the 100 Italians that make up this study, 34 came from Calabria, 31 from Friuli Venezia Giulia, 15 from Veneto, 8 from Campania, 5 from Abruzzo, 4 from Piemonte, 2 from Molise, and 1 from the Marche. These findings seem to make sense when taking broader emigration statistics into account. From 1901 to 1925, the largest sending regions of Italy were southern locations, such as Campania and Calabria. Veneto, for its part, still remained a significant sending region in the north, and prior to the turn of the 20th century, it was the largest sending region, with Friuli and Piemonte close behind. While one cannot make any definitive conclusions based on what is a relatively small sample group, the results can be said to complement existing immigrant statistics and may be considered a small step towards better understanding the regional makeup of Thunder Bay's Italian population. Having come from different regions of Italy, these newcomers to the Lakehead sought to create a microcosm of the life they had left behind. As early as 1904, local newspapers were acknowledging the existence of ethnic enclaves known as Little Italies. In Fort William, the main community of Italians resided in the East End, also known as the Coal Docks, given its proximity to the CPR facilities, with a smaller concentration in the West Fort area. Italians in Port Arthur were largely positioned between Pearl and Bay Streets, as well as along Fort William Road. In both cities, it would appear that these enclaves were made up of Italians from similar regions. In their memoirs, Penny Petrone and Richard James Veltri both state that northern Italians tended to settle in Fort William and southerners in Port Arthur. When comparing these recollections to the data collected in the sample group, the results are mixed. On the one hand, more northern Italians from Friuli and Veneto did settle in Fort William, and a greater number from the southern region of Calabria came to Port Arthur. On the other hand, just as many northerners from Piemonte came to Port Arthur as they did Fort William. and all Italians from southern Italy, with the exception of Calabria, settled in Thunder Bay's southern city rather than its northern counterpart. Secondary source material additionally leads one to question the accuracy of these memoirs. Citing interviews with Michele Salatino and Antonio Fogelin, Pucci asserts that Italians in Fort William's East End generally came from numerous villages in the south, excluding Sicily and Veneto. He also claims that first families in Westport were mainly Vianetti and Abruzzesi, meaning that some hailed from the southern region of Abruzzo. Local historian John Petestio further demonstrates the diversity of Fort William's Italian population. While stating that Fort William was home to more Italians from Veneto than Port Arthur, and that 36 Italians from Decimo, a commune in the Friuli region, settled there by 1914, he also asserts that Fort William was home to Italians from the southern town of Grimaldi, with brothers Domenico, Antonio, and Vincenzo Breccia settling there in the early 20th century. In light of the numerous and contradictory sources on the subject, perhaps the only thing that can be said for certain is that the Lakehead was, and still is, home to Italians of various regions. Given the increasing number and diversity of Italians that settled in the Twin Cities prior to the First World War, one might assume that the Canadian government readily accepted these immigrants, when in fact the opposite was true. Canada's immigration branch, which considered economic utility and cultural acceptability when deciding which European national and ethnic groups should be assisted to come to Canada, classified Italians as non-preferred. The general feeling of the Canadian government is summed up by Sir Clifford Sifton, Minister of the Interior and Director of the Immigration Branch from 1896 to 1905, who said, "No steps are to be taken to assist or encourage Italian immigration to Canada." The reason for such exclusion was twofold. Many Italians sought to work in an urban setting, which ran contrary to Canada's preference for agriculturalists. More reprehensibly, the Canadian government was influenced by racialist thought at the time, combined with British colonial theory, which saw Italian immigrants as inferior and incapable of adapting to life in Canada. The Lakehead was not immune to this backwards way of thinking. In her study of the local working class, the late Jean Morrison states that the appearance, customs, religion, and poverty of the Italians, among other ethnic groups, aroused the intolerance of the Anglo-Saxon, then confident in his superiority to other races. This open discrimination would be reflected in the low social status Italians held in both cities. Social surveys of Fort William and Port Arthur, taken in 1913, placed the unskilled, non-English speaking immigrants, which included Italians, in the lowest grade or class of society. Penny Petrone labels the class system of Port Arthur in the early 20th century as a well-defined pecking order of prejudice, with Italians visibly at the bottom. Petestio also describes Thunder Bay's work environment in the years leading up to the First World War as an ethnic hierarchy, whereby Italians, in particular those from the South, were considered biologically inferior by the white English-speaking majority. In light of this information, it's fair to say that early Italian immigrants settled in Fort William and Port Arthur in spite of the views held by the Canadian government and their host societies. While Italians were not considered culturally acceptable, the Canadian government was willing to overlook this fact due to the willingness of these men to work in poor economic and environmental conditions. Indeed, the foreigners of Fort William and Port Arthur were seen as cheap labor brought to Canada for the purpose of working on the hardest, heaviest, and most precarious jobs. Not all Italians were subject to these trying conditions. A small number of them, by virtue of their education and skills and spirit of entrepreneurship, were able to establish their own, often family-owned businesses, which afforded a more comfortable way of living. Some notable examples of early Italian businessmen include Pietro Belluzzi, who came to operate a general store and wine manufacturing company in Fort William, as well as Giovanni Dolcetti, who operated a bicycle repair shop in Port Arthur. For a significant portion of Italian laborers, such lofty ventures were beyond their present means. Forced to rely on their physical strength, many of these men took up hazardous occupations with one of 3 railways operating at the Lakehead by 1914: the CPR, the Canadian Northern, or the CNR, and the Grand Trunk Pacific, or the GTP. To be sure, over 30% of Italian laborers in Fort William's East End worked as coal handlers for the CPR and CNR until the mid-1920s. It is also worth mentioning that of the 64 men which make up this sample group, at least 24, more than a third, worked for a railway company at some point in their life. The construction, maintenance, and operations of these railways required a tremendous amount of manpower, which Italians were willing to provide. The unwillingness of Canadians and British immigrants to subject themselves to the same conditions only increased the demand for Italians to work on railways and other resource industries. As early as 1901, the CPR began hiring more Italians as certain immigrant groups, such as the British, were considered poor workers. Reverend S.W. of Toronto expressed the role these Italians played best when he described the foreign population of Canada as economic and racial necessities. As vital as these Italian immigrants were considered to Canada's workforce, they were still forced to endure considerable hardship while on the job. The vast majority of Italians that came to the Twin Cities at this time were unable to understand English and had to transition from laboring in an agricultural setting to an industrial one. Consequently, these uneducated, unskilled workers often found themselves the victims of work-related accidents. Between 1900 and 1918, local newspapers reported at least 45 incidents of Italians being injured or killed due to occupational mishaps, the vast majority of which involved the CPR, the CNR, or the GTP. Italians also suffered greatly at the hands of their employers. For its part, the CPR paid its workers very little, given the difficult and dangerous jobs they performed. Workers were further hired on a daily basis, with the amount of men required depending entirely on the task at hand. While these men could have sought employment elsewhere, they were discouraged from doing so, as the CPR offered additional pay to all workers provided they remain until the end of the navigation season. The inability of most Italians to understand English significantly impeded the amount of grievances they could voice to their superiors. The CPR gave preference to Central and Southern European immigrants for this very reason, believing that if they did have problems, it was more difficult for them to make these known to the English language media. Faced with such poor working conditions and limited recourse, it is not surprising that the Italian immigrants at Fort William and Port Arthur engaged in 5 labor strikes, with the CPR and CNR between 1902 and 1912. Generally speaking, the strikers sought an increase in wages, as well as an end to the hiring practices and bonus system that had plagued them for so long. The railway companies, however, were unwilling to grant the demands of their workers and would employ a variety of tactics in order to maintain the status quo. Sometimes the actions of the employers were blunt, such as when the CNR immediately dismissed the dissenting workers and brought in strike bearers to replace them. In other cases, a more insidious approach was taken. After reaching a compromise with the strikers in 1906, most of whom were of Italian or Greek origin, the CPR announced the following year that it would no longer employ men belonging to either nationality. This is not to say the strikers were completely innocent. The stubbornness of both groups sometimes turned the strikes into violent clashes, which, in the case of the 1909 labor strike, gained national attention. Yet more often than not, justice fell on the side of the railway companies. Compounding the plight of the strikers was the local press, which, run by the white English-speaking majority, would often use racial slurs to discredit the immigrants involved. A quote from an editorial in the Daily News, dated October 1st, 1906, shows just how openly bigoted the host society could be when discussing Italians in particular. To strike for more pay is the legitimate prerogative of any man or body of men. But for a community of British citizens to have to submit to the obloquy of insult and armed defiance from a disorganized horde of low-down mongrel swashbucklers and peanut vendors It is making a demand upon national pride which has no excuse. Suffice to say, Italian immigrants in the years prior to the Great War received very little support from the community at large. Yet there was one institution which saw in these outsiders men and women of dignity and purpose. Noted historian Robert Harney states that Protestant groups, specifically Methodists, had a significant influence on early Italian communities across Canada. The impact of these groups could even be felt at the Lakehead. In 1909, Reverend Hiram Hull, newly appointed minister of the Wesley Methodist Church in Fort William, sought to establish a mission which would improve the lives of the immigrants residing in the East End. To help realize this goal, Wesley trustees purchased two small buildings, one a frame-story house and the other an adjacent frame shack, situated on McTavish Street. Hull was motivated by the poor treatment Italians and other ethnic minority groups received in the 1909 labor strike. Yet while the Wesley minister was undoubtedly the driving force behind the mission, he was not the one to lead it. Reverend James M. Shaver was sent from Toronto by Methodist leaders in July 1912 to organize and direct the mission which became known as Wesley Institute. For his part, Shaver viewed the East End immigrants as human beings in need of education and civilization, while at the same time being open to the idea that he could learn from them. In Wesley Institute's first annual report, titled In Mutual Service with Our Kindred, Shaver put these feelings on full display, saying, "We work from the standpoint, not of a nationality, but of the divine fatherhood of God and the equally divine brotherhood of man. If we can help a man to be better, he will be better in our church, in his own church, and will help us to be better in ours." To help improve the lives of Fort William's foreign population, Shaver initiated a variety of programs within the Institute. The most popular and successful of these were night classes, in which Shaver taught subjects such as English, history, and civics, using textbooks he himself wrote. To gauge how many immigrants chose to further their education, one need only look at the annual reports the Institute published. Between 1912 to 13, Shaver states that 60 men and several women were taught to speak, read, and write English. Attendance would only increase in succeeding reports, with 100 and 151 pupils joining between 1913 to 14 and 1916 to 17, respectively. While classes contained as many as 12 nationalities, the largest beneficiaries of this education were immigrants of Italian and Slavic origin. One noteworthy pupil was Emilio Marino, Italian consular agent to Fort William. In his time at the mission, Marino became more familiar with the English language and used this newfound knowledge to speak to Wesley Church young people about the struggles his countrymen had to face, both in Italy and Canada. Wesley Institute was also keen to improve the lives of women by offering classes which focused on cooking, sewing, and housekeeping. As Pucci asserts, some of these classes were intended to challenge traditional Italian customs, such as those related to dietary habits and health-related matters. The Italian people consented to these changes, however, as they viewed the Institute as a friendly, helpful organization, more concerned with instilling Canadian ideals in its subjects than converting them to Protestantism. The mission lastly organized clubs, manual training, and sports, such as floor hockey and basketball, for its youth. According to second-generation Italian immigrant John DiPaolo, these programs provided the children of the East End with a positive outlet, which was unique to religious organizations at the time. Thanks to the influence of the Institute, these youngsters kept out of trouble and became a movement of young people that were trying to better themselves. By offering a diverse range of programs to Fort William's foreign population, it is not surprising that over 500 men, women, and children regularly visited Wesley Institute by the end of 1913. Numbers such as these demonstrate the growing presence of Italians at the Lakehead, but also their willingness to adapt to life in North America. Under Shaver's direction, these immigrants took it upon themselves to learn English customs while at the same time relinquishing some of their own, thus demonstrating their commitment to becoming Canadian citizens. The support Shaver provided Italian immigrants went beyond his job at the mission. In his 9 years at the Lakehead, he worked with them, helped them in their homes and in their disputes, even those that went before the courts. It can therefore be said that Shaver possessed a more intimate knowledge of the Italian people than most. In his opinion, the community at large did not understand the foreign population because their opinions were largely influenced by newspapers, which made a point of highlighting their shortcomings. At least two first-hand accounts reinforce Shaver's belief in a biased press. Lakehead resident Mrs. Gertrude Dyke recalls that her father often read and made mention of Italian murders in the newspapers. John DiPaolo adds that the local press would largely focus on crimes committed in the East End, where a large portion of Fort William's Italian population resided, regardless of who committed them. According to Joseph Mauro, Italians' problems were the most highly publicized among various ethnic groups at the Lakehead. By comparison, crimes committed by Anglo-Saxons were non-existent, as any mention of their nationality was omitted. This inconsistency can likely be attributed to the fact that local newspapers were owned by a white English-speaking majority that would often use racist names when denoting people of a certain ethnicity, as it has already been shown. Able to report the news as they saw fit, it is not difficult to deduce that these men reinforced negative perceptions concerning ethnic minorities while simultaneously showcasing the alleged superiority of the Anglo-Saxon. This is not to say that Italians were completely innocent. Although crimes involving them were reported more when compared to other groups, they were still guilty of committing the acts in question. A look at local newspapers show that from 1906 to 1918, the Italians of Fort William and Port Arthur committed over 150 crimes. The most common of these offenses involved the carrying, threat, or use of a weapon such as a knife or gun. According to Morrison and Mauro, the owning and carrying of weapons for self-protection was a custom settlers from the Mediterranean area brought with them to the New World. An article in the Fort William Daily Times Journal seems to confirm this tradition when an Italian spokesman assures Crown attorneys that it was not for the protection of themselves against the Anglo-Saxon citizen that they carried weapons, but for protection against their own countrymen. While it may have been commonplace to carry a weapon in Italy, such a practice naturally led to confrontations with the Lakehead police. In response to the increasing demand that non-British subjects stop brandishing firearms and other weapons, a significant portion of the Italian population was willing to comply. On December 4, 1907, 200 Italians met in the Port Arthur courthouse and signed a pledge agreeing that they would carry no weapons and that they would use their influence with other Italians to carry no weapons. The success of this meeting can be gauged from an article in the Daily News dated February 16, 1909, in which Crown Prosecutor F.H. Kiefer states, "We have had no shooting or stabbing cases before the courts since the pledge was signed more than a year ago." Of course, the Italians of the Twin Cities did not collectively refrain from carrying weapons thereafter. A look at the local press in the subsequent decades shows that these immigrants continued to be caught for weapons-related crimes. The Pledge of 1907 nevertheless goes a long way towards destabilizing the popular belief at the time that Italians were violent criminals incapable of adapting to life in Canada. Unfortunately for them, the apparent arrival of a 100-year-old Italian organization would threaten to undo whatever goodwill they had acquired and further sully their reputation in the eyes of the community at large. On June 17, 1911, the Port Arthur Daily News reported that Arthur Mauro of Seacourt Street had been charged for carrying a revolver. According to the Italian, he kept a weapon on his person for the past 4 years after an encounter with two men caused him to go in deadly fear of his life. These men were thought to be members of the Black Hand, a criminal organization which originated in Naples but had established branches in various parts of North America by the early 20th century. Sent to prey entirely upon its own race, this clandestine group used extortion to intimidate fellow Italians. Victims would typically receive a threatening letter, which bore the signature of a crudely drawn black ink hand, a skull, or a dagger, and were given two choices: agree to the demands or suffer the consequences. The idea that the Black Hand could have a branch operating at the local level was considered a very real possibility on January 16, 1909, when the front page of the Daily Times Journal read, "Black Hand has appeared in Fort William and Port Arthur." It was reported that this criminal organization made its presence known to the public by sending threatening letters to Italians in both cities. One recipient of these letters was John Besh, an Italian baker in Port Arthur. Fearful at having been marked by the society, Besh confided in another Italian named Sam Parcival. Rather than comfort his fellow countrymen, however, Parcival saw an opportunity to make a profit. He hired a man named Raphael to continue sending letters under the guise of the Black Hand, and promised to protect Besh for $500. Parcival was eventually caught and sentenced to 23 months in prison for his elaborate ruse, though Besh only recovered half of the money he gave away in good faith. Stories such as these lead historians to question whether the Black Hand ever truly operated at the Lakehead. Antonio Pucci argues that it is difficult to determine whether the letters were a product of a genuine branch or simply practical jokes made by individuals looking to amuse themselves. Mark Chocola takes a more definitive stance, saying that the Black Hand was merely a criminal tactic, extortion and terrorism, rather than a full-fledged criminal organization. What is less controversial is the negative effect the Black Hand had on the Italian people. Constant talk of the secret society in the local press reinforced the stereotype that these immigrants possessed criminal tendencies in the minds of its readers. Regardless of whether or not it was real, any mention of the Black Hand only served to increase the cultural divide between the Italian community and the English-speaking majority. Faced with an increasingly fractured relationship with the host society, the Italians of the Twin Cities developed ethnocultural organizations in order to aid one another. Indeed, these groups were intended to provide moral, political, and economic support to non-British immigrants working and living in a hostile and exploitative environment. It is therefore fitting that the first to be developed among the local Italians was a mutual benefit society. This support system generally brings together immigrants of different backgrounds to create a greater sense of national identity among its members. The society which developed in the East End similarly helped its residents break down barriers and help foster a sense of inclusivity. The Italians in Fort William, it may be recalled, generally belonged to villages in southern Italy and Veneto. Hailing from different parts of their homeland and lacking a common tongue, these early settlers found that they were strangers among themselves. Yet, in spite of their differences, they came together in a series of meetings held in each other's homes. On November 29, 1908, they met once more and elected officers for a mutual benefit society known as the Società Italiana di Benevolenza Principe di Piemonte, which convened at a rented hall at the corner of Christie and McLaughlin Streets. The purpose of the organization was for the general advancement of the social relations and to promote more of a spirit of unity among the Italians, the ultimate object being one of benevolence. One could argue that the society went against these goals by initially limiting membership to Italian men between the ages of 18 and 55. This restriction apparently had little impact on the growth of the Principe di Piemonte, however, as its numbers more than quadrupled from 41 in December 1908 to 169 in 1918. For a better understanding of how these men sought to provide mutual aid, one need only look at the constitution they formed. As the majority of members were separated from their loved ones at the time, they viewed the society as an extension of the life they left behind. The constitution that materialized was therefore designed to promote certain traditional norms that in Italy had been fulfilled by the family and the community. Arguably the most important of these norms revolved around death. For his part, the deceased was guaranteed a proper funeral, provided he was in good standing with the society prior to his passing. The Constitution was also quite clear on what was expected of its living members. To help the society reach its specified goal of $75 for funeral expenses, each man was obligated to contribute $1 and was charged an additional $3 in the event that they did not participate in the funeral procession. These stipulations not only demonstrate the significance Italians placed on death, but also the effectiveness of the society to support its members in this life and the next. Another way the Italians of Thunder Bay provided support to their fellow countrymen, even in death, would be to play music in community bands. A 1911 article in the Morning Herald recounts how an Italian band played as it had seldom played before, in a procession honoring the leader's late wife, Mrs. Joseph Del Vecchio. 3 years later, local newspapers would likewise inform readers that an Italian band headed a funeral procession for Mrs. R. Forteza from her home on Secord Street to her final resting place at St. Andrew's Cemetery. It is unclear how many musicians contributed to these local bands, though the number is likely quite low. With a few notable exceptions, such as clarinet player Ralph Colosimo, Italians did not generally engage in the arts at the time. Most men were too preoccupied with the daily challenges of having to support themselves and their families. Because these responsibilities took precedence, it is unlikely that many Italians would have been able to take part in leisurely activities such as a community band. What can be said with a greater degree of certainty is that those who were involved did not confine their activities to honoring the dead. In Italy, town bands would take part in religious celebrations and secular festivals, in addition to funerals. The Italian bands at the Lakehead likewise played for a number of reasons. Newspaper articles helped to shed light on the diverse history of these early music groups. Of the few recorded instances of an Italian band in Port Arthur, a surprising amount placed them at the forefront of political-related processions. According to John Potestio, Italians in the early 20th century were handicapped by their lack of a political consciousness when compared to other immigrants, such as the Finns. Yet, on August 15, 1911, the front page of the Daily Times Journal and Morning Herald recount how Liberal MP candidate and former mayor of Port Arthur, James Conway, was serenaded at his residence by a procession 500 strong, with the Italian band of Port Arthur at its head. 2 days later, the Morning Herald would inform readers that the band also performed at a meeting for the Port Arthur Young Liberals Club. Specifically, it led a parade and played several music numbers throughout the night. Newspapers also placed a Port Arthur Italian band at 2 labor disputes in 1912. At the same time a strike in the coal docks turned violent on July 29, the band was heading a parade which started at the Finn Hall and proceeded through the city streets. The political nature of the procession could hardly be denied, as it was made up of more than 150 socialists, and its leader, Reverend Madison Hicks, was described by the Daily News as the noted socialist orator. The Italian band then aligned themselves with steel rail handlers, who were led by a union of Finnish workmen at Port Arthur. When the union led a parade of over 200 on August 7th, the band is cited as fronting the procession and providing music between speeches. For its part, the Italian band in Fort William played for reasons which were more philanthropic than political. In the same year, the Port Arthur band was involved with labor strikes. The Italian musicians in the neighboring city were putting on a concert with all proceeds going to support McKellar Hospital. The concert took place on March 6th at a location simply known as the Auditorium, and by all accounts, it was an unprecedented success. An article in the Daily Times Journal praised the quality of the program, which featured 9 songs, and said that there was the greatest attendance of people from the sunny land of the Mediterranean that had ever gathered together in a building before in Fort William. While it is not clear exactly how many Italians attended the concert, it is reasonable to say that the band in Fort William garnered a considerable amount of support from its fellow countrymen. The Fort William Italian band lastly participated in religious gatherings, which also drew large numbers of Italian people. Around 1,000 Italians gathered on June 13, 1913, to celebrate the Feast of St. Anthony, the first to be generally observed by the Italians of Fort William. Later that evening, the band marched in a parade with nearly all of the city's Italian population through a number of streets in the East End. A similar scene would be reported in the Morning Herald nearly 1 year later. On April 10, 1914, over 1,000 people and at least 3 Italian societies would march through key streets within the coal dock section to observe Good Friday. The Italian band provided music for the procession, which was witnessed by many residents of the Twin Cities. Far from simply performing at funerals then, the bands at the Lakehead mirror their Italian counterparts by partaking in a variety of venues. Given the large turnout of Italians to these religious observances, it is not surprising that another ethnocultural organization adopted by them was the National Church. Records show that early Italian couples at Fort William and Port Arthur were married in St. Patrick and St. Andrew Roman Catholic Church, respectively, with Matteo Fiorito and Angela Marie Del Vecchio being the first to wed in the former. It wasn't long, however, before these immigrants attempted to establish a church of their own. In April 1907, a delegation of Italians from the East End approached the pastor of St. Patrick's, Father Albini Primo, with the intention of purchasing a small structure on McLaughlin Street. Primo showed the proposal to Bishop David Scollard of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Sault Ste. Marie, to which both of the Twin Cities belonged at the time. To the disappointment of the Italians, Scollard rejected the idea, as plans for a Roman Catholic church in the Coal Docks were already underway. The cornerstone for this new parish, known as St. Peter's, was laid by the bishop himself later that year on July 28th. While St. Peter's was a place of worship which admittedly catered to the Italian residents in the Coal Docks, it was not the national parish they had hoped for. It would, however, provide these people with the man responsible for the creation of 2 Italian churches at the Lakehead. In December 1911, Father Maynard of St. Peter invited an Italian-speaking priest named Reverend Francis Crociata to the East End Church. Such a request was not uncommon at the time. Maynard would often appeal to his Italian congregation by having a priest who spoke their language lead them in a mission. Crociata was unique, however, in that he had succeeded in capturing the affection and confidence of the Italian parishioners in his brief time at Coal Docks. So noteworthy was his influence that he began to baptize Italian children and lead funeral masses at St. Peter's, and was eventually appointed pastor of all Italians in Fort William, Port Arthur, and Westport by Bishop Scollard. With Crociata in their midst for the foreseeable future, Italian immigrants renewed their interest in acquiring a national church to great effect. It is a testament to Crociata's galvanizing presence that Italians at the Lakehead were able to build 2 churches roughly a year within his arrival. As early as December 30th, 1911, Fort William Italians formed a committee of 12 in the basement of St. Peter's for the purpose of securing a church for themselves. To achieve this end, the committee began collecting money the very next day. While deciding on a building site, Crociata conducted Mass at a Finnish church on McLaughlin Street, with the first service being held on February 25th, 1912. He also officiated marriages, as Vincenzina Siciliano and Domenico Breccia became the first couple to be wed at the church only 3 days later. Construction continued into the new year, and on January 19, 1913, St. Joseph Italian Roman Catholic Church, later renamed St. Dominic, officially opened at the corner of McLaughlin and Conley Streets. Even then, the structure was not complete, as work on the exterior had been postponed until the end of winter. Nevertheless, the church represented the culmination of a long-standing desire on the part of the Fort William Italians to have a place of worship which provided them with a sense of familiarity and support. It is uncertain when the Italians of Port Arthur first met to discuss the creation of the national church, but a Daily News article shows that by August 5th, 1912, a strong local committee had been appointed, with members contributing their time and money towards the new building. Although Italians were able to raise more than $1,000, a general canvass of the Roman Catholics of the city was made in order to acquire the remaining $24,000 the church was initially estimated to cost. Father Crociata was at the forefront of this fundraising campaign, which targeted the English, French, and Italian-speaking parishioners of St. Andrew's Church. Father Grenier of St. Andrew's had also been attempting to raise money for a new church, however, and considered Crociata's efforts enough of a threat to his own to register complaints with Bishop Scollard. In spite of these protests, the new Italian Roman Catholic Church, named St. Anthony's, opened with a midnight Mass on Christmas Eve at the corner of Banning and Dufferin Streets. With the completion of this edifice, Father Crociata had achieved his dream to build a beautiful church in the name of St. Anthony, and the Italians of Port Arthur had a place of worship to call their own. The sense of comfort that this new parish provided is summed up by Richard James Veltri, who describes St. Anthony's as a place where these early settlers found their spiritual solace through weekly mass and services, such as baptisms, marriages, and funerals. Under Crociata's leadership, St. Anthony's became a staple of Port Arthur's Italian community, and even developed annual traditions, with midnight mass once again being celebrated on Christmas Eve in 1913. Unfortunately for its parishioners, this tradition would not be honored the following year, as events beyond their control would threaten to undo the faith-related support system they had worked so hard to achieve. On July 4th, 1914, the Daily News revealed that Father Crociata had quietly departed from the head of the lakes. His leaving was said to be the result of a promotion which involved the building of Catholic churches elsewhere. In reality, Crociata had taken a train at Fort William on May 24th after being relieved of his duties by Bishop Scollard. Why was Crociata let go? Although a sexual affair was rumored to be the cause, local historian Roy Pio de Zama maintains that the actual reason for his dismissal was financial mismanagement, as well as grave charges against his moral character. Crociata was provided with capital from the Diocese of Sault Ste. Marie to oversee the construction of St. Joseph and St. Anthony. Yet under his supervision, building materials were not paid for, workers' wages were left in default, and bad checks were written. Around this time, scholars also learned that Crociata had been charged with being an accessory to murder in Rutland, Vermont. In light of this information, the bishop promptly called for his removal. Given the strong sense of loyalty and affection the Italian parishioners had for Crociata, finding a suitable replacement would be a difficult task. Tough as it may have been, Scollard wasted little time in appointing a successor, with Reverend Vincent Giuliano from the United States becoming the pastor of both St. Joseph and St. Anthony in the same month Crociata left the Lakehead. While parishioners were initially averse to change, a sense of normalcy soon returned to the Italian churches. The calm that had prevailed ultimately gave way to tragedy, however, as in the final month of 1914, a fateful accident occurred. On December 22nd, St. Anthony's was badly damaged in a fire. According to the local press, the cause of the blaze was likely a heating device known as a salamander, which was positioned between the ceiling and the roof, burning the latter off. The fire was confined to the top of the building, but attempts by firefighters to extinguish the flames resulted in the interior receiving a significant amount of smoke and water damage. This situation was compounded by the decision of Father Giuliano to leave the Lakehead. In the aftermath of the accident, he went against the wishes of Bishop Scollard by putting insurance money towards building a new church rather than sending it to North Bay. He also requested that Scollard allow him to use some of said money to purchase clothing, as he was incredibly poor, not unlike the churches he led. Giuliano could not count on his congregation to provide financial support either. The Italian communities were equally impoverished, and even if they possessed the necessary funds, the well-being of their church was not considered a primary concern. Frustrated in his dealings with Scollard and suffering from discouragement caused by the apathy of the entire congregation, Father Giuliano felt he could no longer carry out his existing duties. In the months and years that followed, other priests such as Angelo Sansone and Domenico Tomasali would come to the Lakehead and work towards the reconstruction of St. Anthony's Church. For the time being, though, the Italians had undoubtedly lost one of their most significant means of support. Thankfully for the Italian community, 1914 marked the start of another ethnocultural organization, which sought to bring them closer together. On June 14th, the first meeting of an Italian social club was held at 740 Simpson Street, which saw the election of various officers and the initiation of over 200 members. According to the Daily Times Journal, the newly formed group was created to promote social affairs among the local Italians. The extent to which it was able to achieve this goal is uncertain, as very little information concerning the club appears to have survived. At least one more meeting took place on June 21st, though whether any more occurred remains a mystery. One thing that can be verified is that all members of the club were Canadian citizens, as having naturalization papers was one of the requirements of membership. If nothing else, this fact demonstrates the changing nature of Italian immigration. While it used to be common practice for these men to work overseas until they had acquired enough money to return home, more and more of them were coming to see these destinations as their new home, to the point where they actively sought citizenship. This portrayal of Italians as permanent residents that were open to change runs contrary to general perceptions of the time. The 1913 Social Survey of Fort William lamented that social, political, and industrial forces of the community are having little force in the Canadianization of the immigrant population. The Social Survey of Port Arthur expressed a similar sentiment, stating that the immigrants, to a certain extent, form a city within a city. These reports are not wholly inaccurate. In the early 20th century, the Italians of Fort William and Port Arthur established a number of ethnocultural organizations, such as a mutual benefit society, community band, and national church, which perpetuated old world culture and traditions. Yet perhaps even more crucially, these associations provided support for immigrants who were forced to contend with an environment that was both dangerous and discriminant. The majority of these unskilled, uneducated Italians labored at the Lakehead under poor working conditions, which often resulted in serious injury or death. Attempts to alleviate their plight were more often than not rejected by the railway companies that employed them, with labor strikes devolving into violent clashes. Nor did they receive any sympathy from the community at large, as Italian immigrants, especially Southerners, were considered ignorant, untrustworthy, and dangerous by the Anglo-Saxon ruling class. Frequent mention of Italian problems in the local press and crimes supposedly committed by the Black Hand only served to reinforce these stereotypes. In the face of overwhelming obstacles, Italians did abandon some of their more established practices and adapt to a more Canadian way of living. Learning English language and customs at Wesley Institute, agreeing to no longer carry weapons, and acquiring naturalization papers are just some of the ways they took noticeable steps towards distancing themselves from the life they had left behind. The Italian people that resided at the Lakehead prior to the First World War thus retained a sense of loyalty to their homeland, while at the same time adjusting to life in the New World. When conflict in Europe ultimately broke out, the Italians of Thunder Bay would take up the fight, at home and overseas, as good sons of Italy and good citizens of Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin, for your enlightening and informative presentation. It's wonderful to hear research about local settlements and to the Lakehead, now known as Thunder Bay. At this time, we're going to have a brief question and answer period, so we welcome any questions from the floor for Mr. O'Brien.
Yes.
Justin, I've always have been curious, and I really can't come up with a theory. Why was it that the people from southern Italy ended up going to Port Arthur, known as Thunder Bay North, which was fully known at the time, and the people from the Friuli area and the northern Italians ended up going to Fort William? Like, is there a reason for that, or just happened by coincidence, or, I mean, have you come across that? I mean, I have a suspicion, but I just wanted more confirmation on it.
Yeah, I'm entirely certain. I don't know about the original settlers, but I'd say like a majority of Italians would either go to one city or the other, depending on if they already had existing family in those locations. Oftentimes, we'd have a brother or an uncle or a father or some kind of male relative that had already settled in those regions for whatever reason, and then they would encourage their relatives to come there as well, because there were jobs there. There was an opportunity for employment, to make money, to make something of yourself.
Just to follow up on that, I think that's what I was thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
But there was also another example. My dad came during the second current of immigration, which occurred from 47 on from southern Italy under Raffaele Beltri. You probably read the book by John, The Welsh Papers. And my father actually traveled the breadth of Canada. He didn't go to the eastern seaboard, but he traveled from Ontario all the way to British Columbia. And he told me a story that he came across And at that time, Port Arthur, he ran across a friend of his, the late Mauro. And they were friends during the Second World War, and my father was up to Kamloops. And all of a sudden he says, "Ma," he said, "where are you going?" He said, "Why don't you stay here?" So as a result of that, he actually ended up in Port Arthur. So that's just another situation as to how we actually ended up in Port Arthur, which is almost a follow-up from your first original answer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
Jacob.
Hi. You briefly talked about it, but was there no positive change that came from these road labor strikes? Or was it all just mostly negative?
No, some changes did come about, although the companies in question, like the CPR and the CNR, fought tooth and nail with the strikers. They were very unwilling to grant any changes, but they eventually came around to doing so. And the Italians themselves also improved the ways in which they actually fought the strikers. Instead of simply using their fists, they developed unions and were able to fight them through more legal means.
Thank you.
Antonio Pucci.
Just a congratulations on your research.
Oh, thank you very much.
I also think that the title of your lecture is very excellent. As you know, I analyzed the minutes of the Principe di Piemonte from its inception, and I always was struck how devoted to the patria these immigrants were. They just loved Italy, you know. And this was a guiding principle for them, to do honor for the patria, so that people here, the immigrants, had to behave properly. To do honor to the patria was the big reason why. And I think for most immigrants at that time, Italy was a rather new country. I mean, 1871, 30 years of existence as a nation, but what they meant by the patria was their family back home, their village, their region, Calabria or Veneto, and the beauty of Italy, the heritage of Italy. So, as I say, I was really amazed at how devoted they were to promote the good name of Italy by behaving properly.
That's very true.
So,
yeah, I didn't.
that was very good.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't touch upon it as much because I didn't have the time. But like you said, because Italy was such a recent country at the time, around 30 years old, a lot of Italians didn't really see themselves as Italians. They kind of identified more with the regions or even the provinces or the villages that they came from. And it was only later on in the 20th century, through the result of ethnocultural organizations like the Mutual Benefit Society and events like the First and Second World War, which kind of drew them closer together and helped them kind of see themselves as Italians. And okay, and the title actually comes from a quote from one of the books on the table over there, from Penny Petrone's Breaking the Mold, in which her mother gives a speech at the, I think at the Italian Hall in the Second World War, praising the soldiers, calling them good sons of Canada, good citizens of, good sons of Italy, good citizens of Canada. Because you definitely see that in that tumultuous time, with the Italian soldiers wanting to prove their worth as Italians, but also as Canadians, maybe even more importantly as Canadians. You see that in the First World War too, to a lesser extent, but I think, yeah, the Second World War is where it's really, where their patriotism is really put on display.
When are you going to do part two?
When am I going to do part two? Well, I was thinking November if this goes over well. Yeah, because this presentation, as you've seen, talks about Italian immigrants in the years prior to the First World War, but the second part would focus on that war period from 1914 to 1918. And I was thinking November, be right around Remembrance Day. I think it would work out quite well. And I've already done the research for that period. It's just a matter of writing it and then making an accompanying PowerPoint. So it hopefully shouldn't take as long to put together. This one took a little while because it's been quite some time since I acquainted myself with PowerPoint, so it was kind of a learning process.
And just a follow-up, what kind of assistance have you received in doing this research?
Well, I haven't gotten to it yet, but I was going to do an acknowledgement section. And, but that's okay, yeah. I can just say some institutions that have definitely helped me in my research then. I'd say first and foremost it would be the Thunder Bay Museum. I've gotten a lot of help from its curator, Michael John, who's actually in the audience tonight. Thanks for coming. Yeah, they allowed me to use a computer at the museum, which is unlike any other in the city, in that it allows me to look at old newspapers that have been digitized, but also I'm able to search through them by typing in keywords. So that saves me a lot of time and effort in having to look for articles. My process was initially to just type in, a simple word that would bring up a lot of hits, like Italian. And then from there, I'd kind of go through them and see if there was anything I could use. And then if I found an article that was interesting or relevant to me, I'd make a note of it. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to make a copy of them at the museum, or I wasn't able to put one on a USB, a copy. I would have to go to the Lakehead University and use their microfilm machine and then save it to USB from there. So the university was also a big help as well. And another one is definitely the City of Thunder Bay Archives. And again, I have someone else from there in the audience today, James Mastrangelo, who's also been a very big help in my research there. He's helped me with all sorts of matters relating to census data, looking at old Henderson's directory books, and especially photographs, a number of which I've incorporated into this PowerPoint. So I would probably say those are the big three organizations when it comes to people or institutions that have aided me in my research. Yeah.
You do a big part in all the times. You play a big part because you put your jobs that nobody else wanted to do. You built Canada alongside of everybody else. Yeah, that's one we need to learn about that. The jobs on the rail that nobody else wanted to take, and that was a hard job. Making minimum wage, or not minimum wage, but making peanuts, right?
Yeah.
Compared to what everybody else was making.
Absolutely. No, it was an incredibly difficult job for them, and they didn't receive any kind of extra help from the community at large. They just did the best that they could do with what they had to help build the country, but also help sustain themselves and their families. So it was kind of a mutually beneficial relationship, I suppose, even though the community itself didn't do them any favors.
How did a lot of the people come from Europe? Were they sponsored by certain groups in order to immigrate to Canada, or did they have to pay their own way, or how did that come about?
I believe they did have to pay their own way. They would often arrive with the steamship from different ports in India and Canada, respectively. There would usually be a middleman known as a padrone, who Italians would write to, and then the padrone would kind of pass on the message to any family that was in the New World countries, such as Canada or the United States. And so there would kind of be this communication between these two groups that would kind of facilitate a transfer then of one group over to the next.
Just to follow up on the question that lady asked, I'm talking about the second current of immigration because that's the one that I know a little bit more than the first. Paolo Grimaldi, getting back to Paolo Valtri, he was actually the person that sponsored a lot of people from the town of Grimaldi to come to Canada and work on the CN. He used to call them the Ester gangs. And the only commitment they had was that they were actually committed to working there X number of years. And so that's how they actually made it. And at that time it was only my dad, but I think about all his siblings and every other parent, relation of mine that I know came the same way. Because they just didn't have the money to come over.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I didn't touch upon that railway group as much just because they aren't as relevant to this particular time period. But yes, in the Second World War, the Veltri company certainly did help employ a number of Italians that have come from Thunder Bay, for sure.
And if I could add a little footnote.
Absolutely.
My father came through Welsh as well, country, but footnote on the origins of some of the early Italians here. Some of them came via the U.S., just working on railroads and just crossed the border and found their way here, and then they stayed, right?
That's right. That's right. It's like I said at the beginning of my presentation, how in the 1880-81 there were only 5 Italians in Fort William, but by 1911 there were thousands of them. Italian immigrants really didn't start to come to Canada in large numbers until the turn of the century, until the 1900s. Because up until that point, they had jobs in a lot of other destinations, such as the U.S., like you said. And again, the fact that the Canadian government didn't really classify them as non-preferred and didn't really kind of encourage their immigration also limited the amount that actually made it over. Now might be a good time to do the acknowledgements.
For sure.
Thanks. Sure. So yeah, obviously I didn't do this alone. I couldn't have done this alone. I had help from many different people, and while I won't get into detail about what they did, as that would probably take another 45 minutes, I will just briefly mention them, and if you'd love to, you could stand to just let everyone know who they are, but if not, that's okay. So I'd like to thank Dennis Torch, Patricia Del Paggio and her aunt Rose Bertone, my Nono and Nona, Pasquale and Cecina DiPaolo, my parents Eva and Kevin O'Brien, my sister Lindsay O'Brien, James Mastrangelo, who, as I've already mentioned, works for the City of Thunder Bay Archives, John Cecino, a teacher at St. Ignatius High School, and Italian language teacher at Lakehead University. Tori Tronra and Michael DeJong, both of them who work at the Thunder Bay Museum. Of course, local historians Antonio Cucci, John Potestio, and Roy Piovezzano. The Da Vinci Center for allowing me to hold this presentation here. Leah Nadim, of course, the president of the Institute of Italian Studies. And my girlfriend, Claudia Nulina.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Justin, please accept this on behalf of the Institute of Italian Studies. We welcome you all to help yourself to some light refreshments, as well as opportunity to ask Justin any additional questions. Thank you all for coming this evening. Buonasera e ci vediamo presto.
We have a picture.